Well, we're fortunate that Ambassador Rick Barton can fit us into his schedule. He's the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations and the Secretary of State's Senior Advisor on Conflict and Stabilization. His bureau is responsible for the State Department's efforts to improve U.S. government effectiveness in preventing cycles of violent conflict and addressing crises. And he leads a team of 160. During CSO's first years, the top priority countries on which it's focused have been Syria, Burma, Honduras, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Nigeria. Previously, Ambassador Barton served as the U.S. representative to the Economic and Social Council of the UN and was actively engaged in the creation of UN Women, the advancement of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, the Millennium Development Goals Summit, the suspension of Libya's voting rights on the UN Human Rights Commission, Haiti's post-earthquake reconstruction, Democracy Fund initiatives, and efforts to better align U.S. and UN development country programs.
It feels the same to me.
He also led independent reviews of Iraq reconstruction and developed civilian strategies for Iraq, Sudan, and Sri Lanka, created new measurements of progress in Iraq and Afghanistan, and initiated path-breaking approaches to conflict reduction in Pakistan and Nigeria.
That was probably my own word.
He taught for 5 years at our competitor, Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He served on the Smart Power Commission as an expert advisor to the Iraq Study Group and led conflict-related working groups at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Princeton Project on National Security. He has a BA from Harvard, just informed me he was just a couple of years behind me, and an MBA from Boston University and an honorary degree from Wheaton College. So thanks for coming, and take it away.
Thank you very much. It's thanks for the really good introduction, and it's great to be here. And I really want this to be a conversation. There's a lot to talk about in this space, and I know that many of you are thinking about it seriously as something that either you followed intellectually or that you're a field that you want to work in. And so I hope that we will have most of the time for a conversation. So let's try for that. I did want to say there's a little bit of an old home week quality to this, because I remember my father was responsible for the fundraising, for organizing the fundraising for this kind of East Campus. And I was only about 10 or 12, so I didn't really follow it very closely, but I remember the model the actual physical model being in our living room for a couple of nights. So, so it's kind of hard to believe that 50 years later, here we are. But it does feel like home. So thank you for the welcome. What I'd like to do is to start off by just sort of describing the challenge that we're facing, and then do a quick survey of the way the world looks right now. Maybe then put forward 3 golden rules for how we have to work to match this new world of conflict and crisis that we're in, and then just leave you with an example for each of those golden rules, and see if I could do that in about 15 minutes. If it starts to draw on too long, I'll probably just cut it short, and I'll be happy to tell more stories during the question and answer session, because there's plenty of opportunity there. The challenge that we were given by Secretary Clinton, and now is continuing with Secretary Kerry, was to make the United States government more coherent and more effective in conflict and crisis situations in order to break cycles of violence. So that was the challenge that was put to us as a new bureau within the State Department about a little more than 2 years ago. And the first thing we naturally had to do when we started, this was not totally a startup. It was both a startup and a merger of an existing institution. So bureaucratically, quite a challenging event, and happy to get to that in the later discussion. But the first thing we had to do is naturally look at what's the reality, do an analysis of the world that we're operating in. And the first thing we noticed is the conflicts of today, even though they've been lessening, they've really become much more complex. It's hard to figure out who's at war with who and who the parties are, and there's just the borders and an awful lot of other elements aren't anywhere near as distinctive as they were. And while the countries at risk of great social unrest has actually increased substantially during that time as well. So there's a lot going on. There are very few invasions of the kind that we've been seeing the last few weeks. That's somewhat unusual, but there are lots of foreign troops in a lot of other people's countries. So it isn't just the Ethiopians and the Kenyans in Somalia or the Ugandans in South Sudan. It's just, you look around, and some of them are on official missions, and some of them seem to have informal residence in other places. And of course, the United States is, we have military outposts in many, 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 many countries as well. So it's a somewhat confused state of play around conflict that we noticed. But then also, as we came out of the post Iraq and Afghanistan period, there was a rather dramatic change taking place, I think maybe without our fully recognizing it, inside the U.S. government. So we had spent the first 10 years of this century with essentially highly militarized operations, dominated obviously by Iraq and Afghanistan. But then our intelligence community had really moved to almost completely a terrorist identification concern, which had also left it in a somewhat weaker state in terms of understanding the broader context. And the development community had moved into almost a totally apolitical space of health and food. So you have a sort of a weakening of the military response as the first choice, and the sort of the growing sophistication about the understanding of the terrorist threat, you have this huge demand for how do we deal with this unrest taking shape. And one reason I believe that we've seen two very, very, very active secretaries of state is that the demand side has just grown so great, and in a way leaving us with what you could call a golden opportunity for diplomacy. Now, this is, as somebody might say, this is fraught with opportunities. So it is not kind of a no-brainer at that point. So the third trend that we looked at was the American public. And the American public, as many of you have seen through the Pew Research and whatnot, is probably at its most lopsided balance in favor of the U.S. minding its own business, was the phrase in the 50-year history of that survey. So we didn't have an American public that was leaning in on this work, but partially, I believe, because we hadn't been all that successful. And it's a little bit like a sports team that loses for a few too many years. I don't know if you're New York Knicks fans or what you have here, maybe Columbia football fans. It's not as encouraging as you would expect, and it starts to show up in the number of people in the stands. But the American people are pragmatic, and so they basically see a decade of mixed success, and that's kind of where they are. On the other hand, from my time at USUN, I saw that the return of the United States to kind of a less exaggerated posture was an extraordinarily welcome event, and almost anything that was being started at the UN, the member countries were looking for the U.S. as sort of the partner of first choice. Now, that doesn't, again, it's the UN, it's a little bit like the U.S. Congress. You can't always get results, but nevertheless, when things were started, that's where the way people started. So the final thing we really looked at was this demand side that I just talked about, and I think what you've seen from Secretary Kerry and Secretary Clinton in particular, that there's a huge demand side for the U.S. to play and to really make a difference. So the second test then is, are we ready for this golden opportunity? And is this a moment that we could actually respond to and take advantage of? And I would say that there are three things that have to happen that we've really focused on. And I just, for the sake of this conversation, call them the sort of three golden rules. And the first one is to help the United States and our allies to focus most on what matters most, so that we're not just drawn into everything all the time, everywhere, and that there's a lot of ways that we see that, but the United States tends to show up with what we have available as opposed to what is most needed, and that's true also of many of our allies. But it's a very dynamic space. There's often a competition of views, ideas, past and ongoing practices, and we have to sort through that more skillfully, or the United States energy and the effort is going to be dissipated. The second golden rule that I'd offer is that we must find ways to project out and into countries, societies, and people that do not require massive security operations, fortress-like embassies, or caravans. So we've got to go, obviously, have to go subnational. We have to broaden our reach. We have to expand our person-to-person diplomacy. We have to take advantage of many of the mechanisms that we have that are readily available today but are not necessarily part of the traditional portfolio. And the third golden rule that I'd offer is that we have to think of ourselves as catalysts. We have to help people to get to a point where they can make it on their own. And this is very much not the model of the colonial world or even of the superpower world. We can go in and tell people exactly what they're going to do for the next 20 or 30 years. It's not going to work that way. The American public doesn't have that appetite. And actually, democracies occupying other people's space for too long really undermines your domestic democracy as well as the country. So all of these rules really come together to what I would describe into a more mature, a wiser, a problem-solving model that's tuned to the times. You might even describe it as kind of a cooler heads policy as opposed to father knows best. And so I think it is much more contemporary. So what I'd like to do in the last few minutes here is just to give you one live example of each of how we've tried to approach each of those golden rules. And there are lots more examples, but I think just to give you a sense of what we're trying to do. So the first one is how do we focus on what's more important and drive the locals to what they have to do? And clearly it starts with a rigorous joint analysis, not the analysis of just the Refugee Bureau or of just the Counterterrorism Bureau or of any other bureau, but really of an interagency view. We have to produce priority-driven planning and strategies, which again, what's most important as opposed to what are all the things that need to be done in a place. We have to find agile and liquid implementation. The U.S. government generally cannot get started on many things in less than a year, so that's a pretty big window of opportunity. In a shaky place, you don't really want to wait a year because a bad night at the saloon and you may be on your third president by the next morning. And that's a reality of many of these places. And all of this has to generate results and leverage local energy to solve their own problems. So that's the model that you're really looking for. And I'll just give you one quick example, which was Kenya. In Kenya, last year, there was great fear that there would be a repeat of the prior election where over 1,000 people had been killed and 500,000 people had left their homes. And the confidence that the political leaders could actually turn violence on and off was shot, and it wasn't a particularly good model to begin with. So there was a real concern about what to do and how to do it. And the reality was that the United States has about an $800 million a year portfolio of overt assistance in Kenya, and none of it was directed at the threat of election-related violence. So the natural entry point was, well, how do we help Kenya run a more honest election? And it turns out there's an industry of people that do election work here in the United States, in the international community, but that's not exactly what was needed. There had to be some way to build a box that would keep the political leaders from using that primary organizing model in this election. So they're for higher violence. How could you box them in so that wouldn't happen? And we had just so the embassy knew this was the number one problem, but again, the portfolio wasn't on the problem. And so we were very lucky that the AID's Democracy and Governance Officer in Kenya hosted a meeting one afternoon for us in the Rift Valley, which had been the center of much of the violence in the prior election. And we had already put some organizers on the ground at a subnational level in the Rift Valley and also on the coast, because we thought those were the two hot spots that were most likely to generate the violence. But they'd been there 3 or 4 months, and they'd gotten to know the local Catholic bishop and the Episcopal bishop and the Coca-Cola bottler and some student leaders. But it's a pretty tough job to actually land in a place and become expert in it and then be able to turn loose any local energy and exploit it. And what we did is, so we had a roundtable conversation with the dozen biggest recipients of U.S. assistance. And none of them were in the political space, other than some people working on the elections. And the first question we asked was, what do you think is the biggest problem facing your country this year? And one person quickly said election-related violence. And everybody in the room went. All the Kenyans in the room went. And then we said, are you doing everything that you would like to do about it? Would you like to do more if possible? What could you bring to this conversation? So the first person to speak was a man who ran a horticulture program. And he said, I don't know if this would help, but I only have 4,000 farmers in my program. And so I said to him, well, I have a little bit of experience in American politics. And if I started with a base of 4,000 farmers, I could be elected governor of any state in the United States except for Texas. And so they all seemed to get that might mean something. And then, so the next person to speak was the woman who ran an AIDS program there. And she said, we visit 120,000 households a week in this area alone. So suddenly you could see that there was quite a dynamic opportunity at play here. But they all had 24/7 jobs, and their funding was directed at their jobs. So we asked them, okay, if you wanted to guarantee the integrity of this election, and if you wanted to make a stronger connection between the police and the community so that there's an early warning and an early response system, because early warning without the response doesn't mean anything, what would you need to activate your base? And they all basically said, well, if we could hire 1 or 2 more staff for the next 4-month period, the 2.5 months leading up to the election and a couple months after the election, we could really turn these assets into something of importance. And that's what we did. So in the next 6 weeks, we just created the mechanism for them to hire almost 200 Kenyans to take all of these native organizations and turn them into something that was influential. And they came together as a group called Champions of Peace, and they then worked with social media, they worked with local student groups, so the multiplier effect was underway. And while the election results have been doubted by many, the election process and the absence of violence was actually a real success. But again, it was mostly about focusing our efforts in the place that was most important and really seeing if we could contribute to the key issue facing these people. The second example is really one more about how do you reach into a country? How do you get beyond all the obstacles that we have today, the dilemmas of working in dangerous places in a post-Benghazi world and the rest of it? And what I'd like to do is quickly give you the example of Syria. Syria obviously has all of the obstacles that you could possibly have. We can't get any Americans across the border. It's completely a cross-border operation. We work almost exclusively in Turkey, which means we have the constraints of how the Turks see the conflict as well as how the U.S. government sees the conflict. But what we've tried to do, and it was a new population of people as well. Actually, the U.S. government didn't know the people who had started the revolution inside of Syria. Our embassy had not been in touch with those people because if you were a political activist, you were either dead or living in exile, or you changed your profession. So we didn't have a roster of who are the people who are likely to get this going. We also did not have an embassy there after a very short period of time. So there we were. We didn't actually know this population either historically or have the ability to stay in touch with them. So the first thing we had to do, and this is a gaping hole in an awful lot of what the U.S. problems over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been that if you don't actually know a lot of people on the ground, it's a very difficult place to have a success if you send in soldiers or other people. And so what we did is we dedicated a lot of time right away to seeing if we could get to know more Syrians and get to know them better, because that's sort of the core starting point for everything. And the way we did that is with a whole series of train and equip sessions that we brought Syrians out into Turkey, and we ran week-long courses where we also gave them high-level communications equipment and other things. And that became the organizing principle. We ran about 1,500 people through that. And that then became the base of contacts that we have built upon through a whole series of other U.S. government initiatives as well. But probably the two things that are most interesting about how, in terms of programming, how do you reach into it? Because part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that the big ideas land in a very practical place. So if you have a big policy idea and you can't turn it into practice, it doesn't have much value. And if you're not constantly being informed by practice, then your policy is going to be out of touch. And so we're trying to bring those two things together in a more direct fashion. And I would say the two ways that we've done that most effectively inside of Syria, one is we've helped a whole group of very resourceful Syrians start 11 FM radio stations where we've provided the technology that now reaches 80% of the Syrian public. So for the first time ever, there are Syrian voices that are not dominated by the regime who are providing independent information to the Syrian public throughout the country, plus two television stations. And many of them started initially almost like traffic reporting stations. You don't want to go there or you'll get killed today. But now they're much, much more sophisticated, totally independent of us. It's not a Radio Free Europe type of operation. These are Syrian voices, Syrian control of content, and they are doing a remarkable job of broadening the understanding of the Syrian people to what's happening in their country. And one of the places that we got to see this and that was really incredibly inspiring and rewarding was to see some of them at Geneva during the negotiations actually questioning the Syrian regime in a way that they'd never been questioned before at their own press conferences, and threw them way off stride and showed the world just how repulsive their leadership and their practices have become. So again, that was a secondary benefit. But the second thing that we're doing there that I think is of high value is direct assistance to some of these local police forces that are taking shape in the liberated areas of the country. And of course, the number one thing that everybody's looking for is public safety, which they cannot guarantee safety from the bombing, of the regime bombing, but what they can do is make the streets more predictable. And there are many defected police who are there, but they were missing the simplest. In Aleppo, where we started with 1,200 policemen there and a very good police chief, they were missing the simplest item for survival, and that was stipends. And for $100 a month, you can basically keep a policeman on the street, and you can also have sort of a firewall against some of the extremists that are coming in. And so really a minor expenditure, much less than we'd spend if one of those policemen became a refugee in Jordan, for example. And they're providing a service that, again, would cost much less than if we have a full scale training program and whatnot. And the final story I'd like to share with you, because I am going a little longer than I had hoped to, is, okay, how are we as catalysts? How do we help to promote something that's going on in the country, but we want it to be better and we want to expand its reach? And I'd just like to quickly talk about Burma in that case. In Burma, the U.S. policy basically had three critical elements. The first, let's encourage the diplomatic expansion of the country. Secondly, let's deal with the long-standing ethnic conflicts. And third, let's do business with Burma. Let's do business. 60 million people in a nice part of Asia. Why don't we? It's a good market, stable. So, which of those three issues do you think is probably getting the least attention? Dealing with ethnic minority conflicts that have lasted for decades. It's sort of like, do we have to push the generals? Do we have to? It's a very delicate moment. Can't we do that tomorrow? And I think what we've been able to do is to see that there's a tremendous amount of energy, that there are champions inside the government, that there are people who are eager in the ethnic minorities to be part of a peace process. The country's on the verge of a nationwide ceasefire. We feel that within that space, we've been able to help those people who are eager to see this advance, to really make progress within their country. And I'd be happy to get into it a little bit more as we have the discussion. So there's lots going on. I think some of it's in the communication space, some of it's in the analytical space. A lot of it is just in terms of how we deal subnationally within countries, but there are a lot of opportunities, even in this more constrained international environment, for this, what I believe is this golden era of golden opportunity moment for diplomacy to make these places more peaceful. And so what I'd like to just finish up by just saying is that I hope that many of you will go into this kind of work. It's unbelievably stimulating. I feel, I tell the people that work for me that we get paid to do what Mother Teresa had to do for a lot less money, and that we actually probably have a chance to have a greater reach with it. You're obviously going to, I hope in our conversation that we'll get a chance to talk about some of the elements of starting something new in a large and fixed bureaucracy, because that's a terribly important part of your work. Somebody once said to me when I started this job that 90% of my diplomacy would be inside the State Department. So actually, they said 50%. And I said that for about a year, and somebody came up at a forum like this and said to me, "You're very naive. It's actually more like 90%. And now I really understand my job. It is 90% dealing with the inside world and 90% dealing with the outside world. So you better be ready for that 180% challenge. But it is stimulating, and you actually can change these organizations. And George Shultz was quoted recently as saying that we live in a world that's awash in change. And to be part of that is quite a privilege. So that's certainly the way I feel, and I hope that that in this conversation I can encourage those of you who are still looking ahead at doing some of this work, and those of you who have enjoyed doing it with some of the experiences that I've had and some of the inspiration that I've enjoyed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions and your challenges. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. It was very stimulating. So I have a variety of questions, but I'll open it to the floor before I take my privilege. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Hamid. I'm from Afghanistan.
Oh, can you come up to the mic, because we are recording this? And it's not that we can't hear, but because...
There's a YouTube audience out there that can't wait to see you. A very limited YouTube following.
And if you have a question, just sort of queue up, please.
Hi, thank you very much for that very informative discussion.
Thanks.
My name is Tamim. I'm from Afghanistan. I'm a Fulbrighter here studying. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to keep it just too short. First, I think when it comes to Afghanistan, I think for all good reasons, President Karzai has been, the president, and for all bad reasons, I think. But I think we should not equate Afghanistan to him. Afghanistan is not Karzai. He does not represent, now at least, the entire Afghanistan. And I think my question is, we are going to have an election which will go to the second round, most probably by any estimate. And we will foresee a lot of, probably a messy election. And what kind of measures the U.S. State Department has in place in terms of related disputes when it comes to the election, because different parties might not accept the results, as it looks like, as it happened in the last election in Afghanistan. And then Secretary Kerry had to go and negotiate and mediate between people. That's one, and then the election-related violence, which might happen.
Yeah, yeah.
The second question is the role of Pakistan. By all standards, there is ample evidence that Pakistan has been exporting terrorism all over the world. I mean, just recently yesterday I read in their own newspaper that they're sending people on the request of Saudi to Syria to fight. These are extremists. And they are sending a lot of people in my country. Just 2-3 days ago, we had a big attack on Serena Hotel there, and a lot of people died. Why is it that the United States is kind of resisting to put the required pressure on Pakistan to be at least attentive? Because I remember President Bush told President Musharraf that the Afghan election is my election. So if you wanna create problems for Afghanistan, it's basically you're creating problems for me. But right now, I don't see that commitment. Maybe I'm wrong. Thank you.
So do you want me to just answer that?
Yeah, please.
And also, my colleague Andrew Hyde is here, who spent a year in Kabul, and welcome to call on you, Andrew, as well. To if you want to be part of these answers, feel free to join in. Looks like your son has joined us. I could tell there's just enough resemblance. So let me just take on the Pakistan one. I think the United States has been very consistent in terms of putting quite a lot of pressure on the Pakistanis. It's a large and obviously independent-minded country, and that I did when I was at CSIS. I did a large study on how much assistance we were providing to Pakistan, and the formal U.S. government number at that time when I did the study was that it was $750 million a year, and we rounded that number up to $2 billion a year, without too much effort and without getting into any of the potential covert funding that might have been in play as well. So you'd think, well, $2 billion a year, you have quite a lot of leverage, which again, that would be comparable to the numbers we were spending in, let's say, Egypt, Israel, and very few other places. But these are big places, and a lot of that assistance was going, we judged that 90% of it was going to the Pakistani military. There are a lot of people who believe that much of this terrorist support was coming more from the intelligence side of the Pakistani society that was not necessarily perfectly aligned with their civilian government or their military. So but I think it did give that particular study actually gave pause in Washington, because it got to be a number that people couldn't deny, and so there was initially a Kerry Lugar and then a Biden Lugar and then a Kerry Lugar piece of legislation that was going to rethink the whole U.S. puzzle. But many Pakistani politicians think the United States is too directive, is too involved, and I think at the end of the day, Pakistani ownership of its own terrorism and what it's doing to their own society is the critical element in becoming less of a disturbance in the neighborhood as well. And it's turned out that the attacks on within their own society and the loss of control of geographic regions and whatnot has become kind of an undeniable fact of Pakistani life, and that's probably where the solution is going to come. Now, how we help drive that, how we make sure that, because in all societies, there's a natural instinct to blame others. There's conspiracies or whatever it happens to be. And so getting to that more mature discussion that it's your problem and we will help you with your problem, as opposed to it's our problem and we will solve it inside your country, is really, I think that's where we need to go. Now, in Afghanistan, it's more in a transitional state. There's plenty of transitions going on everywhere, but in the United States, I've seen the election team. I haven't met with the U.S. election team for several months because it's really not at the center of my own very kind of demanding life. But I was very impressed by the preparation and the way that people were thinking about it, the recognition that there would be entire areas of Afghanistan that might be still so insecure that it'd be difficult to run an election, and then the question would be whether you were taking results from those places, which could then skew the if there were no results, that would skew the, if there were no votes, that would skew the results, and if there were too many votes, it would skew the results. And I think there's a very high degree of awareness within the U.S. government, and there's a real effort and a commitment by the U.S. military and the diplomats for this to go as well as possible. But I think everybody is ready for a pretty high degree of messiness. That doesn't mean that you're going to catch all the eggs that get broken, and that's because it's way too dynamic a place right now for that to happen. So. Again, but we've empowered so many thousands, tens of thousands of more Afghans than we ever have before. And the question is, can that new nucleus, have we gotten to a tipping point? Is there critical mass? And that's the fear that everybody has. But I do think the United States is trying to play a very constructive, without a full ownership role of this. And this is one of these critical moments in this, at 15 years in, that's or just about 15 years in, that we're looking to. So it's not a very neat answer. I'm happy to have help if anybody. We can come back to it some more. So don't feel limited to your one question, or I'm sure you have more to follow up on. Yes, sir.
Yeah. My name's Adam Carroll with Burma Task Force USA.
Good.
And so I was attracted to this event because a lot of Muslim countries, Syria, Nigeria, and Burma is not a Muslim, but we have got the issue of the Rohingya, and those were on the, and now we're talking about Afghanistan. So obviously there's a lot of interest in our community about rights issues. It's a big mess in Burma. I liked very much hearing about the projects in Syria. I don't know if the scale is sufficient, but from what you said, they're creative and they're in the right direction. How about in Burma in terms of civil society engagement? Because right now, Aung San Suu Kyi has not said anything of note or strong about the Rohingya issue.
Yeah.
And so there's really a mess with military involvement in the way the government is expected to develop, in persecutions, land theft, a whole range of issues. And as you mentioned, one of the priorities is investment. And is that really the overwhelming priority right now? What can you do with civil society to ensure that human rights are being prioritized?
Right. Well, thanks. I do feel that our ambassador, Derek Mitchell, is really got a very wise and balanced approach, and I think he has been an advocate for advancing the peace issue, and he's been one of the leading spokespeople inside the country on the Rohingya issue. And in fact, he has directed somebody from our office to spend a tremendous amount of time out in the Rakhine State area, just to improve the understanding and to show that there is a growing international concern about it. So it's one of these long simmering kind of issues that has been put in the denial pile, and taking it out of the denial pile and talking about it on a daily basis is obviously one part of the maybe getting to a better solution. I just met with some representatives of Refugees International yesterday who had spent some time, I think about a week and a half out in the Rakhine State, and what they expressed to me was concern about the curtailment of freedom of movement for the Rohingya population. So the encampments and the housing had improved dramatically, and their humanitarian assistance had improved, but they were being kept in very contained spaces, and that was the issue that they brought to our attention, and that they're obviously that there will be a huge concern of our embassy there. I do think that I think the United States has been an extremely constructive player in moving those military leaders who want to see a change, and moving the new, somewhat civilianized government. It still has a strong military quality to it, to just addressing these issues. The way we started our own engagement there was carefully worked out with Ambassador Mitchell, And we felt that the way to get started was to use the landmine issue, which happened to be one that tormented both the ethnic minorities and the military and local citizens, and use that as the takeoff point for broader community-wide conversations. And we focused on Kaya State, which was a small state. It had been a little bit like starting in Rhode Island. But it was a place where the peace process, we had been told the peace process was farther along there than perhaps it was in Kachin State or in other parts of the country. So we started with the landmine issue, not even landmine removals, just landmine awareness and landmine mapping as the starting point for a conversation. And it has turned out to be a useful instrument for bringing people together who otherwise have not worked together on a common concern. We thought it might be a model that could be replicated in other parts of the country, but the ceasefire agreements seem to be moving faster, which is great. And it may be that the next generation of challenges is how do you monitor ceasefires so they actually hold and they have meaning rather than people using them to their own tactical advantages. So it's a very dynamic space, but I do think the United States, we have quite a few watchdogs in the Congress who are extremely concerned about the human rights issue, probably through the work you and others have done, I suspect. And so I think we've struck a good balance, that it's not too cautious. I like to hold up a kind of a criteria, that a scale that I think is important for people in the State Department to think about. On one end is native caution, and on the other end is American ingenuity. And I ask people, where do you think the State Department is generally on that scale? And within the State Department, most people say, we're pretty good on native caution. But I would say that in this case, in the Burma case, it's been one of the more encouraging sort of progressions. It may seem evolutionary to you rather than revolutionary, but it's been a progression where that we've struck the balance between native caution. And there was policy early on and concern early on that we were pushing the generals too hard, that the reactionaries would in fact react, and then we'd be back to where we'd been. And we've tried to strike that balance, and I think that the landmine program was one way of doing that. So anyway, I hope that kind of answers your question, but as usual, if these questions are long and more intricate than you want, give me a multiple choice.
Hi there, I'm Delaney Simon. I'm a former student here. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your insightful comments, and Dr. Long for moderating. I wanted to know, many of the countries that CSO works in have a lot of different international organizations, NGOs working, diplomatic communities from elsewhere. And so I just wonder if you could elaborate more on the challenges and maybe the achievements that you've faced in your work working in those countries with different partners.
Great. Well, that's a good question, because Andrew probably put you up to it, because he runs our partnerships. So I probably should just turn it over and he can give you his work plan for the next year. But we believe that the first qualification for doing this work is to know that you need help. So if anybody tells you that I'm working in Burma and I've got it knocked, or whatever country it is, then they've disqualified themselves by definition. So we know we need help. We're always looking for it. We have one of the things that Andrew has worked on a lot is to create a stabilization leaders forum, which is 7 countries that we work with closely: Canada, Australia, Germany, Holland, Denmark, France, and ourselves, and the UK, of course. And what we found is that what we're trying to do, rather than just coming to agreements and saying we're all friends and we share the same interests, is to find actual places we can work, and if you've got a good leader, let's get behind that person. If you've got a good platform or program, let's invest in that, so that we don't all come in and hire all the teachers as our drivers, and pretty soon there are no schools and the rest of it, which has happened in a few places I've been in. And in particular in Syria, we found that some of our mass communications initiatives have gone over very well, and we've been able to work with a number of those countries, and where we're literally putting money into each other's initiatives. And I'm looking, for example, at Burma right now, because we met with the Canadians and the Danes in the last 2 weeks, and both of them are looking to do more in Burma, and they don't know quite what to do. And we've spent almost 2 years working on this, and we feel like we've done our catalytic bit. And so rather than looking to the United States, another part of the United States, we're perfectly happy to work with the Canadians and the Danes and anybody else. So on that level, on the multilateral level, same deal. We need to find, in particular in places like the DRC or the sort of the Great Lakes, which we're now taking a look at. That is such a heavily populated zone by the international community that's really the preferred way to get in. So much better to get in rather than on a bilateral basis, to see if we can get the UN to fulfill its promise in that particular place. And so that's the way we're thinking about it. But again, the challenge for Andrew this year is not to have a lot of people who love us, but to have actual show me where we're working well together. That's the challenge. And let's do it in 2 or 3 real places, as opposed to the theory of we're all in this together. I think the theory we're pretty solid on, but now it's just the evidence that we can actually trust each other enough to go with that. And I think we've had some good experiences, but we need to make it more dynamic still. It's a growth area.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I think my papers have obviously worked. The only thing I'll mention is obviously partnerships beyond other governments. So civil society, business, we're looking at a whole range of
Absolutely.
partnerships. Not to mention,
Good.
of course, local partners that are very important. So.
Great, thank you.
I want to jump in and springboard off Delaney's question, and I know Jim, so he'll cut me some slack on preempting.
He looks pretty ready, though.
Hey, no, I know he's very ready, but it's related to this. So I
He's
think
caffeinated.
It's a good point to. True. It's a good point to jump in. You know, the word covert showed up several times in your talk. So without getting into details, how well do you feel your efforts are able to coordinate with and maybe even achieve synergies with covert efforts in some of these places?
Well, lots of ways. I mean, the first and obvious way is we're fundamentally an overt operation. So all the information we collect and anything we know, we want to share with the world, because we believe that actually people knowing more is part of a solution. So that idea alone enriches the covert community so dramatically. I remember when I was teaching at Princeton, there was a retired, a very, very senior retired CIA officer who came to one of these meetings, and he said, now that he was outside the CIA, there was a representative of the CIA at the briefing, and he said, now that I'm outside the CIA, I have an advantage that I never had when I was in. I have complete and open access to open sources. And it was sort of, now obviously the intelligence community has really moved into that space, but for a long time they weren't even in that space. So the 1,600 people that we have worked with give us phenomenal insights into what's going on, and we exchange that information, but we would do it with the New York Times. So the only time we don't do it is we think somebody's going to get killed as a result of kind of some relationship they have with a foreigner or with us. So I think that's, but there are a lot of other ways of doing it as well. The lack of coherence that I mentioned, sort of the joint analysis, the strategic priority setting. We try to do, one of the things that we do that I believe has huge value, and I'd like to see more of it still, is bringing together all the people in the U.S. government that we think are active in a place, so they actually get to meet each other and they talk to each other. It happens the State Department has a huge natural advantage as a convening body that it doesn't naturally use because it doesn't have that instinct. People don't typically go to the Pentagon for a group meeting, and they don't go to the CIA for a group meeting. They go to the White House, but it's hard to get into. They have to have the right birth date and the right Social Security number, and then small rooms. So there are advantages to doing this at the State Department, and we need to take advantage of these things. And again, I mean, if it sounds insanely sort of practical, there's a lot of money still to be made in kind of practical investments. It's kind of like Warren Buffett, you know, he buys Coca-Cola and he makes a lot of money off of Coca-Cola. It's not the most exotic product in America, but it's okay. People are still buying the stuff. So I think that's what we've had to do in our first couple of years here, is to just stay practical, look at where the opportunities are, and one of them is to bring these communities together so the U.S. government isn't at counter purposes. And a lot of meetings you go into, people are there representing their office as opposed to representing the broader demand. And we're trying not to be the desperate little office that needs some work somewhere. Okay, we're trying hard not to be that way, because if you do that, then you fall and prey to sort of a bureaucratic instinct, which can be very damaging. I hope that answers your question.
No, thank you.
Okay, we're ready now.
Thank you. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Nigeria, in particular, what your offices are thinking about in terms of a conflict like that. Secondly, the pros and cons, what you've learned from disarmament programs over the past 20, 30 years. Have they worked? Do they work, et cetera? And thirdly, you were suggesting, what I found interesting was setting up, I guess, low-power FM stations in Syria, or community radio stations. And I was wondering how that has worked, or how you've been thinking of doing that in Africa. Because as you may know, in Africa, when you have these kind of initiatives, they set them up as technology centers.
Yeah.
They're setting them up as like, not only you're going to do a radio station, you're going to do an internet, da-da-da. And in Africa, cell phones, particularly Kenya, are a big deal. It's the major form of communication, cell phones. Right. So I was wondering if you could go into a little bit. I mean, again, it's not like here in the United States, but nevertheless, social media, and I don't want to sort of, like that becomes like, a buzzword to talk about as if you're in a comp lit thing to talk about Michel Foucault. But I'm just saying, like, what do you think about, what are you thinking creatively about that technology, which is a mass technology. In Nigeria, forget about it. I was in Nigeria a few years ago, and that's all they do is go on the cell phone.
Okay, good. Well, let me start with the technology. We're completely open, enthusiastic, eagerly pursuing whatever technology is available. And of course, even in Africa, the range of technology is so different. Kenya is extraordinarily well wired. South Sudan, not at all, really. Nigeria, hugely advanced. Explosion right now of television and radio stations, in addition to lots of advertising money, a lot of things going on. So we're in touch. Most of these places we participate, we partner with another part of the State Department in putting on tech camps at a lot of these places. We've done that. We've done one now in Burma. We've done one in Honduras. We're planning them in other places where you basically get 100 or 200 community activists, and they decide what problems they want to talk about, and all we do is sort of present some of the more advanced technology that's out there. Again, we don't have great expertise in our office. We have like 2 people in our office who have that really fairly far along in their own youthful development compared to some of us. And so we want to be exploitive of it, and we sometimes use some advertising, for example, with Facebook, to drive people to other Syrian opposition Facebook pages, because we thought what we wanted to do is to popularize what was already going on out there. So we're trying not to create this stuff. We're trying to use the energy that's there again, and then catalyze what we spot. I'm from Maine. It's a lot easier to swim with the tide than against the tide, and it turns out the tide exists everywhere on Earth. So you don't always get a 40-foot drop, but you get some motion. So we're enthusiastic about it. I'd like to see more national dialogues. People are always talking about, we're going to have a national dialogue, and then it takes years to get a national dialogue. We're going through that in Libya right now, which we've been tracking for 2 years and having a hard time to work on. I'd like to see us try to use the cell phone technology in an extraordinarily well-wired country like Libya to get these processes going. because you can't get the political leaders to do it, and you can't find the space, and you can't draw everybody into a stadium. There's just a lot of things that are keeping you from getting started. So how do you get started on it and do some experiments in the space? So we're enthusiastic about it. I'm sorry I didn't talk about that earlier, but I'm glad you raised the question. And then in terms of Nigeria, Nigeria is in a very, very dynamic state, but its government is probably a couple of decades behind many of the developments in the society. So how do you bring this dynamism of the society and the post-colonial governance a little bit more together? And what we've tried to do is we've ended up focusing actually on the delta rather than on the north, because the delta is the source of about 80% of the government revenues, is most of the economy as well, and it's had an amnesty for the youth of that area that's just about to expire, and the president is from that area, and a lot of the political ferment is taking place in that space. And we cannot get to the north very easily right now. And the north conversation is being dominated by kind of the threat of terrorism. So we actually thought that the greater existential threat to Nigeria might well be if there was a return to violence in the Delta. It was also the most accessible entry point for us. And what we've actually done is we worked with a newly formed group of Nigerians that include the Steven Spielberg of Nigeria, local community activists, business leaders, and others, about 15 or 20 people. And they've developed a scheme which I think is just wildly imaginative, which is that the Steven Spielberg is actually training young people in 7 communities how to make films about the biggest problems and how they're solving the problems in their community, turning those films into a reality television series about making movies, turning that into a studio audience, which is going to declare a winner and have popular voting and mass participation. So what we found out there was that there were a lot of people studying corruption and studying the inability of the government to deliver services. And here's an amazingly resourceful community where everybody has a way to solve their problem, but this is what they think of the government. The government, those guys never do anything for us. They're going about solving their problem. The government has got potential because it's decently funded and has a few other things to its advantage. Seeing if we can bring them together in a way that popularizes a lot of this work, because what was happening is the World Bank was going in and doing a study of corruption. And I asked the author of one of these wonderful studies, a young Nigerian who had been a Fulbright, asked him, how many people do you think read your report? And he said 7. And so I thought, well, there's 25 million people in this area. How do we maybe popularize this thing? And they've come up with this idea, this series of ideas, which I think is brilliant because it fits with the Nigerian society. Unbelievably dynamic, maybe a little attitude, and a few other things that are going on. And we're taking advantage of that rather than trying to create it all. So, and my feeling is if it works, it will then work in the north as well. And we're not going to be able to put a lot of people on the ground in the north, so coming in by air is okay. It's a good way to go. You've got to find other ways to get into places. You can't say this place is shut off from the world. That is not the case any longer, just about anywhere on earth. So, and then on disarmaments, I think the only great disarmament program I ever saw was in Haiti, right after the U.S. invasion in 1994, when the Tonton Macoute began to think that having a gun was a disadvantage in my community. And it was a disadvantage because the vast majority of people suddenly felt empowered and protected by the U.S. military. And so it was the one bully in town who had the gun suddenly was, no, I don't have a gun. Because if I had a gun, they may kill me. That was the best disarmament program I ever saw. I've seen toys, I've seen Guns R Us, I've seen a lot of other ideas. Most of what we're talking about is small weapons, and I assume that's what your question is about. You're not asking about nuclear weapons. Yeah, okay. Because I think the nuclear weaponry programs have actually worked, because those are agreements between formal governments, at least up to this point. But this is much more at the popular community level. There has to come a moment where people realize that somebody in town has a higher authority than I have, and otherwise everybody holds on for dear life to protect themselves, and it's pretty tough to stabilize a country. So I think you have to address it. I'm very interested in the problem. Haven't had a chance really to do much work on it in the last few years, but I think it's one that it's a recurring problem that we have to. But I'm kind of more. I'm interested in making the police capable of doing their jobs in a lot of these places, and that's and again with a respect for rights at the same time. That's the route we've taken so far, but it's a good question, and I think we've got to spend some more time on it. Please.
Hi, my name is Yanang. I'm a Fordham student, and I am Nigerian.
You're Nigerian?
Yes, and
Oh,
I'm
good.
from the north.
Yeah, good.
And I live in Kenya.
And you live in Kenya?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was there for the last 2 elections. So,
You've been there for the last 2 elections?
yeah.
Okay, well, wow. You're the source of all of our problems.
And you've kind of answered part of my question, because for a long time, I personally, based on the news, got the impression that part of the problem in the north is just intelligence. It's the military has been criticized for going too hard and violating rights,
Right.
and the people are kind of split. On the one hand, like, what else would you have them do in the light of lack of proper information to go on?
Yeah.
And I was going to ask about, how the U.S. intelligence is cooperating with Nigerian military intelligence to deal with it. But then you mentioned that it's kind of hard to penetrate the region, which makes sense, seeing as I've been there. But are there other ways? Because while the ideas you're talking about for the South are innovative and very good, pretty much the North is so underdeveloped that a lot of these technologies don't get there. You're aware that there's a huge electricity problem. And some of the places in the North are so remote that you don't get cell phone coverage. Some people have never seen electricity.
Sure.
And meanwhile, this Boko Haram is tearing apart the very fabric of society. Is a huge sense of fear and distrust, even of everybody, both the government and the society, because it's almost like a guerrilla war. The civilians by day, and one day they decide to kill you. And so, what else do you suppose can be done to improve intelligence? With the U.S. working with the government, before we wait for the great ideas to blossom.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, it's a tough question, and I haven't been to that part of Nigeria in a number of years, and the closest I got was up to Jos. But some of my teammates in the study that we were doing went farther north, and so that's really my last real personal knowledge of it. But I would just say, put a couple of things forward. I think there's a great likelihood that it's still being dealt with as too much of an official problem. So that's the military response is the dominant way that the government is addressing it. And I think it's somewhere between denial and having a military response seem to be the two central elements of the official government dealing with the North. And at the same time, obviously, the division you're talking about, because Lagos, when you go to Lagos now, it's just another world. It's actually, Lagos for me has progressed in my visits, it seems to be better run. It seems to be more independent, and that's because, as I understood it, the governor there had quite a strong disagreement with what the prior governor and now the successor governor basically had disagreements with the central government. The central government sort of cut them off, so they actually had to start to raise and collect taxes as opposed to just living off of the oil and whatnot. So there's a sense of responsibility, and there's a progression there, and there's a certain wealth developing, and there's an activity level and whatnot. And obviously in the north, that doesn't seem to be taking hold. So there's this natural division which is very frightening, in addition to the Boko Haram and the terrorism. So, but for me, I think before I'd really be able to suggest kind of how you get on this, I just have to have better knowledge of it, and I'm not comfortable with this being looked at just through the dominant terrorism lens. I think that's an important way to think about it. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago, where about a dozen of the northern governors were there, and there was one of those governors who was really just very reality-based, and he was extremely articulate, and his predecessor had been assassinated, and his life was constantly at risk, and he just struck me as if he was pretty grounded. And so it's that kind of, those sorts of insights that we really have to push harder before we sort of go all into either the terrorist argument or whatever else it is. And I'm pretty sure that our ambassador is looking at it the same way. So it's not a very comfortable, it's not a very clean answer, but that's the best I can do right now.
Dipali Mukhopadhyay, member of the faculty at SIPA. Nice to see you back at Columbia, Ambassador. I had the good fortune of making 2 trips to the Turkey-Syria border this summer and got to witness some of the trainings that I think your office was supporting. Wow. And it was really fascinating to see Syrians who've been, especially young Syrians who've grown up without any opportunity to express themselves politically, wrestling with questions about the future of their country. It was a fascinating and an interesting model, it seems, of a more pragmatic, minimalist way of engaging in state making or state building. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that kind of engagement with those, let's say, 1,600 people through the radio stations and the police, how does it connect to the larger power dynamics on the ground? Where does it fit in with the Islamist militias, with the regime elements, with the kind of broader contours of the conflict, and who's actually in control of these cities or these governorates? And also, if you can talk a bit, one thing I was struck by as a researcher, I was warned by the legal counsel's office at Columbia, be careful about talking to people in the regime because you might be violating sanctions. Be careful about talking to people connected to Al-Qaeda. You might be violating counterterrorism laws. What kind of constraints does your office face in terms of who you're actually allowed to engage with, allowed to support, allowed to be in dialogue with? And how does that connect again to this question of who's actually in power and is going to determine the outcome of the conflict?
And if I can piggyback on that, how do you identify who it is you're dealing with? So you got 1,200 policemen in Aleppo on the payroll. How do you know 300 of them aren't AQ affiliates, or et cetera, et cetera?
Well, you just reminded me of several of the migraines that we've accumulated over the last year and a half. It's because you can imagine we've been trying to be kind of path breakers in a couple of these spaces, and as a path breaker in the U.S. government, we've had a chance to deal in great intimacy with our legal office and our Hill representatives and just about anybody else you could think of. So I'm happy to give you a little taste of that. But let me start with your first question, sort of how does this tie back to the broader policy? We think that one of the critical policy challenges for the United States all along has been to to work with, to support, and to make more capable the moderate opposition for today and for tomorrow, so that hopefully that it will make them more capable for their resistance to the regime, but also for the moment when the regime is no longer there or they are governing in their independent spaces. So that's our strategic, that's the reason we're doing this. And that does go back to sort of one of the initial goals of the United States, that there would be a transition from this regime to a more moderate opposition that would be a responsible neighbor. I mean, so it does fit in under there. The really big challenge, Syria is a tough challenge, because if you talk to any Syrian, almost any Syrian, I've probably spoken to a couple hundred over the course of the 2 years, so not as many as any of my colleagues. Almost every one of them starts the conversation with "stop the bombing," and they'd like us to turn it off like this, and it's totally understandable. But most of the work we're doing is in the part of the conversation that follows that. So I do think it has a strategic purpose, but there's one piece of reality there which really colors everything else, and that is that as long as the bombing is taking place, that is the number one concern of everybody. And 140,000 people have mostly been killed by air, not by hand-to-hand fighting, and most of the millions that have left their homes have left because of that. So that is the big reality element to this, and that's obviously, and there are lots of good reasons for why that hasn't happened yet. Obviously, if we could have gotten through the UN's, the Security Council, that would have been the simplest way to get to it. But we try to anchor everything we do on some larger strategic objective. And if we can't find that, and if it's not one of the top 2 or 3 things the United States is trying to do, then we are doing the wrong things, even if we're doing something small and sort of hopefully that will become, that's a building block, a pilot, something that could become representative of more work. Now, then the second part of this, how do you figure out who you're working with? Well, we have a vetting process in the U.S. government, and that has, for whatever information we have, we go through that information. And so we cross-reference human rights abuse information with terrorist information, with whatever other information might exist. And we try to check. But so that's what we've done. We've done that for 2,600. As of a few weeks ago, we've done that for 2,600 people. Now, generally the data kicks out that about 5% of these people have names that raise an alarm. And then we check it out, and it turns out it's Muhammad or Elijah Muhammad and Muhammad Elijah, and there are quite a few people by that name, and so then we get down to maybe 1% of the names are potentially have problems, but this is really imperfect information. So then what happens when you suddenly pick up a group of 1,200 policemen? Now what we did, so this was a migraine for some time. For 2 months we provided stipends, and then somebody in the U.S. government said we needed end user vetting. Up to that point we had vetted the 35 commanders. And we had felt that those are the people we were giving the money to, and that they were responsible for paying the people who worked for them. So then this question came up, and for the last 4 months or so, we have not been able to provide the stipend to the Aleppo police. So it turns out that there are other people who may not be as constructive as us, who like to be in this game, and that one way that you establish some loyalty, not a lot of loyalty, because still people are there for themselves in their own job, was to be able to keep them alive and keep their families alive. So the argument we made within the U.S. government was that at the $100 a month level, we're probably not going to be keeping too many terrorists. It's not scary. We're not making them that capable. And that if we don't if we don't take a risk here, if we don't try to work with the 1,200, we could lose, because there are maybe 30 or 40 of them that could have some, at one time or another, have had a phone call with somebody who is maybe on a terrorist list, that we could easily lose the whole game. And so you need to, this is one of these places you have to make a choice. It's not a perfect choice, but we made the argument within the US government that it was a good choice, it was a risk worth taking, and that that we were likely to learn much more about these people working with them, and if we found out that somebody was questionable, then we would stop working with them right away. That was actually much better information than all the data systems that we had, phone calls or whatever they might be. So we won that argument in the U.S. government about 10 days ago, but it took us, and by the way, guess what? We finally got the Aleppo police to be willing to give us the individual names. Because when we asked them for the individual names, it was about the same time that the Snowden stories and other things were out there. And people said, why should I give my basic data to the U.S. government? I'm not sure that's a good thing. And my life's at risk already. So I'm not sure. I don't need like a target on my head quadrupled. So it's very interesting how these macro stories come back into a micro space like this. But that's why I keep saying you got to have the policy and the practice come together, because here's a very practical thing. So we finally got the names from the Aleppo police chief, who was really reluctant to do that. Even though I said to him, most of the information we're asking from you is what I just gave my hotel tonight in Istanbul. My name, my address, my email. That's about our level of sophistication. So anyway, we got it. We got the clearance finally, and so we're going to start providing stipends on I was told on the 27th of this month we'll be helping the Aleppo police again, and hopefully it will help to stabilize them at a very reasonable cost that will give them the opportunity to do their job. So, but it is a live question, and it actually took a decision at very high levels of the U.S. government to decide that this was a risk worth taking. But it's exactly these kinds of risks that you have to, that's precisely what you have to do in this era if you're going to practice diplomacy, because if not, you're going to be, I have an ambassador there, but she can't get off campus. She can handle 3 visitors a day and whatever. It's just like, okay. So it's a really good question, and I hope that answer gave you some texture.
Thank you. Al Diaz, no institutional affiliation. It's follow on the previous question on Syria. How do you attempt to square the circle? Because, and at the same time, how do you deal with the elephant in the room, or I should rather say the bear, and it's an angry bear now. Not just the bear, but the dragon is looking closely at what is going on. I don't know which animal, or which in the animal kingdom that would describe the most concerned party, the Islamic Republic of Iran. How do you, I don't know if you had the opportunity of reading a story in the Wall Street Journal today. I don't want to make a big thing of the story of the Jur, but it gave me the impression that the Assad regime is a bit ahead of the game in that is pursuing its own strategy of reconciliation by, and from what I read, is paying, at least in the focal points that they have been concentrating. What's your opinion?
Well, obviously the getting the Russians and the Iranians and others to play a more constructive role inside of Syria is that's a high diplomacy game that we've put a lot of effort into, and we haven't it has not yielded many results yet. It's been a constant source of frustration. And I think there's a belief that it is central to the eventual resolution if there's going to be any kind of negotiated settlement. Now, whether that's going to happen or not is I think very much up in the air. The advantage of the regime is that it essentially has one person in charge, and it's even if that person is loaded with pathologies, that there's a clarity of direction, which is obviously a huge problem. I think the fact that Assad is willing to destroy his country in order to remain its ruler that's his fundamental contradiction, which is going to prevent him from ever coming out the other side of this thing. It doesn't mean that he cannot cause a ton of misery for some time, and how we reduce that human suffering is really our core challenge. When I started working on Syria maybe 2 years ago, most of the opposition felt that it was going to win, and it was just a question of when. And they were even very candid about how many people would likely die in that process if they did not receive help. So they said, we're going to win this thing within the next year, but we will probably lose 100,000 people. When I was there this fall, the suffering of war had become the central storyline. The suffering was much greater than people had expected. The inevitability of the win was not clear in people's minds. But their resistance to Assad was every bit as determined as it had been, because they couldn't believe how barbaric his willingness to what he would do in order to stay in office. What levels that had reached. So there is even in what's considered sort of a dynamic stalemate. That's the way some people describe this thing now. Although I think the current storyline is closer to that Assad has the advantage right now. But I just don't long term. I don't see that. It has obviously been compounded by the arrival of so many extremists, and that also fits a Western narrative of the extremists are taking over. I don't believe that's happening, but nevertheless, it's a threat, and it's one more thing that the opposition has to deal with. And the opposition was already at something of a slight disadvantage in terms of a big disadvantage in terms of weaponry, but not in terms of local support. So it's a really difficult one. I think that a big part of what's a challenge for us is if we do this, what result does it produce? And we haven't. So many of the things we're doing, the vast majority of the $2 billion of assistance that the U.S. has provided has been humanitarian. The vast majority of it, nearly somewhere between 80 and 90% of the assistance has been humanitarian assistance. So all we're doing is helping people stay alive. We're not really shifting the emphasis, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out, how we could have a greater effect in that other space as well. The aerial bombardment, it remains a problem, as do the Russians and the Iranians, obviously.
Well, we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. I'm going to ask one, and if anybody thinks of one, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about where you started from. If 90% of your diplomacy was inside the building, because starting a new bureaucratic entity is tough, but you were inheriting a mixed legacy from a predecessor, and at the same time, it's clear your organization is the scale you laid out. You're quite far at one end compared to the rest of the State Department. I mean, you're wanting to really be out there to provide stipends, to start radio stations. I mean, very creative, very on the American ingenuity versus the native caution side. So how did you grapple, and how are you continuing to grapple with these entities? And what have been the big roadblocks you've had to face?
Well, I mean, the first thing you really need to do, again, this sort of gets to your last question. The first thing I believe you always need to do is have your own sense of direction. So if you kind of know where you're going, and this is why I'm just getting back to the last question that I didn't really speak to. The Syrian opposition, I'm very respectful of the Syrian opposition, despite all the criticisms we've heard of them. If you think of a group of people who have had 30 years plus 40 years of suppression and really systematic, you can hardly ever run into a Syrian who hasn't had a member of the family either tortured or killed. That's pretty extraordinary. That's a really well-organized regime that can do it. I think of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein as being like teenage boys who ran their country for 30 or 40 years. But this was Syria has been run by adults. And so the professionalism of the oppression. So the Syrian opposition, why this is relevant, is that the Syrian opposition, guess what's going to be missing? Trust. And what's the essential element of sort of political cohesion? Trust. So the first thing that I believe you have to do when you're running an organization is to actually have a pretty clear sense of direction. And then you have to build a really good team. And then you have to communicate endlessly, tirelessly, repeatedly in order to make sure that your own people, plus everybody outside, understands it. So, for example, we just had, 2 weeks ago, we had all of the ambassadors from all the United States ambassadors in the world came into Washington. And we just figured, okay, this is a very important trade fair for our bureau, because we've up till now we've been working one ambassador at a time. That's that's what you have to do. So the countries that we chose to work in, the ambassador, we had to impress the people there, and now they were coming together. And so part of what we wanted to do is get some of that word of mouth. Okay, that's really how you grow within an institution that's quite traditional in many of its constructs. But you still have to prove to every single ambassador that what you're doing works, and it's not going to take over their embassy. You're not going to so there are both positive and negative energies that you have to deal with. And so that's really what we did, and we found that we do have a base of about 20 ambassadors now who speak very highly of us. So that's, again, one way of doing it. Then there's obviously the Washington world as well, and they feed off of each other. So you have to deal equally well with that. But our direction was that we decided we wanted to work in places that matter to the United States, when at an opportune moment, and where we thought we could make a difference. And we could do something that might make a difference, and that was our building block, basically. And we thought that actually doing stuff in real places was the best way, rather than saying we built a brand new stadium and now we have a winning football team. It wasn't that we had to show that we had a winning team, even if it was a sandlot team, and then the stadium would follow. So that's the way we've tried to go at it. There's a lot more to it, but those are some of the principles that we've tried to follow, and we think we now have. But what I was starting to say is that when I looked at those 200 ambassadors, or however many were there, maybe 150, but a lot, I figured that 50% of them didn't have any interest in us whatsoever, because they hope they'll never see conflict or crisis in their country. It's like, if I see that guy, it's scary. So 50% weren't even paying attention. And then of the remaining 50%, only half of them were listening. So 25%, so that's not bad. I mean, that's kind of the building block. And actually, when we have reviews and inspections, we find out that there's still a lot of people say, what is it that they do? Now, just to give you one more bureaucratic lesson. So I went to visit one of my colleagues who's the assistant secretary of a bureau that was started in 1973. So it's not that new. And she said to me, actually, people still treat me inside the State Department like I'm a new bureau. And then as I walked out, I saw that two of the giants of American diplomacy, John Negroponte and Tom Pickering, had both been, in my job, assistant secretaries of that bureau at one time. And I thought, okay, they've been in business for 41 years. The giants of the organization have led them, and they're still being treated as if they're the new kid on the block. So that gives you a sense of it gives you a sense of the challenge. It's not a gimme. It's not a slam dunk, and it's not mission accomplished. Still got a few years of work ahead.
Great. Great. All right, we have one more time for one quick question.
I guess I'm the last person.
So this has to be a true-false question.
I'll
Multiple
try.
choice.
I'll try. Hamida Sedli, Harvard University. In discussing the Syrian conflict, I'm sorry that I arrived late and I didn't hear the earlier remarks. To the extent that I was here, I didn't hear anything about the role of Saudi Arabia and the United States collaboration with Saudi Arabia. If the United States is spending more than $2 billion or so to conduct humanitarian assistance, why is it that, in your opinion, the United States is not actually stopping Saudi Arabia, who has been extremely involved with the activities of Al-Qaeda, the jihadis, and Al-Nusrat and others in Syria? And my second question is that a number of studies that have dealt with post-conflict situations have looked at the issue of gender as a strategic point for conducting these conflicts. I wonder whether you can elaborate a little bit on the question of gender vis-a-vis the conflict in Syria.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I can do it a little bit in Syria, but I'd rather, on the gender question, I'd rather talk a little bit more broadly about it first, and that is that one of the strategies that we've been following is to constantly search in every country we work in, every place we operate in, for what we consider silence the majorities. So if you're looking for change in a society, there are a couple of the two most obvious populations are women, that gets you 50% of the people, and young people, and that gets you another 25% of the people. So right away you start with 75% of the population. So demographically you're pretty well targeted, and those are generally two populations that are not too entrenched in the ruling class. Okay, they hardly ever run the place. So if you're looking for change, generally if I'm running the place, I'm totally happy with the way my bureau is being run right now. But if you wanted to change it, you'd have to look for somebody other than me. And so I consider that to be true of a lot of situations. So women, to me, are a huge target of opportunity, and they are a constructive force, potentially a constructive force if mobilized and in the political space. Young people as well. So those are my two default change agents when I analyze a place, because they've got a lot of potential. But a lot of it is potential as opposed to the sort of the fixed advantage. So
I guess what I meant to ask was whether or not in this particular case of Syria, you have seen gender as being used for strategic advantage of waging.
We have worked really hard at doing that, but it is not, I would say we're nowhere near a critical mass. I sat at a meeting like this in Gaziantep, 30 Syrians around the table, 3 women, 1 a judge who still wants to be a judge, but she's defected, so she's not inside the government, but she's a judge, and 1 who's a local member of the new council, of the new education council in Aleppo, and a 3rd who's from Homs and a great activist. And the most dynamic part of the conversation, they all hated the regime and the rest of it, but in terms of the most outspoken comments were of a traditional form that you might have expected. That the many of the men in the room doubted that the women should play as active and dynamic a role as they wanted to at this point, as they felt they had the right to, and as we had given them the opportunity to through our training and through basically bringing them on as co-equals into these meetings. So it's the kind of evolution, it's the kind of revolutionary change that actually happens inside of these crises moments, but it doesn't necessarily always produce a result yet. But we're very eager to see it happen. It's totally consistent with U.S. policy. It was obviously, look, if you took Secretary Clinton's two major contributions, one was she helped the U.S. get reaccepted in the world, and two, she empowered half of the population of the world to its own political standing. Two fairly significant contributions when you think about it on a macro basis, a pretty big deal. So it's something we're working on. I want to see it do more, but up to this point, it's one more of these things that you just have to work hard every day. We're not at the takeoff point, certainly inside of Syria. It's still a distinct minority. The second thing on the Saudi and the U.S. alignment, I think the Saudi and U.S. alignment, I think there are a lot of diplomacy has been put into making sure that the Saudis are not supporting people who we consider to be terrorists. And there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done in that space, and I think some progress. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual investors, non-governmental figures, wealthy individuals who violate that from various parts of that part of the Arab world. But it's something that we've spent a lot of time on, and I know the president is going out there the next few days, and I suspect this will be an ongoing conversation. But I think if there's much official support, I'd be really surprised if that's been worked on by a lot of. I haven't had a chance to work on that, but I know a lot of people who are working on that.
Well, great. I think that all that remains is to thank the ambassador for, I think, a very thoughtful and frank discussion. So thank you very much.